So we're going to finish what I started last week and make a good start for what was the plan for this week, and then next week we should be back on schedule again. So last week I spoke about social welfare functions, utilitarianism, where the sort of the strict or the conventional form of utilitarianism is the one that you see in the middle, where we simply add up utilities, and that then becomes social welfare. But there's of course absolutely no reason why you would want to add up utilities. And if you play with a gamma parameter there, which is the pure rate of inequality aversion, then you can actually put more emphasis on, at least if gamma is positive, you can put more emphasis on the least well-off in society, right? That is where I got stuck, and I just posited the existence of a social welfare function, right? Following Bergson, Samuelson, and Atkinson. But by now somebody should have told you also about Arrow's impossibility theorem, which says that there cannot be a social welfare function that satisfies the following axioms or criteria. Of course, there can be a social welfare function. That is just something that we can agree on. But Arrow, a very young Arrow, much younger than the picture that you see here, showed that if you have an economy with 2 agents and 3 goods, or 3 agents and 2 goods, and we cannot say how happy other people are, we cannot directly compare utility, then you cannot take individual preferences and aggregate them to a social preference function or a social welfare function if that social welfare function meets the following criteria. Non-dictatorship, nobody can impose their will on others, which I think you agree is a good thing to have. Non-imposition, which means that if everybody hates a solution, then it cannot be the case that society loves it, right? Which I think is also a reasonable criterion. Unrestricted domain or universality, where you say, well, we can apply this to everything that might come our way. Independence of irrelevant alternatives. It's also a good one to have. If you prefer watching a football match over watching a rugby match, then it should not matter to you whether there's Wimbledon, whether there's tennis on or not. You should still prefer rugby or still prefer football over rugby, right? That is independent of the question whether tennis exists. It's a good criterion to have as well. And monotonicity. That is, if everybody feels the same, but somebody starts preferring something a little bit more, then society should also start preferring that a little bit more, right? And if you say, well, these are reasonable criteria, or if you want to replace monotonicity and imposition by unanimity, that is, if everybody agrees that this is the best solution, then society must also agree that this is the best solution. If you want to impose these conditions on the social welfare function, then you cannot take individual utility functions and add them up or somehow aggregate them to a social welfare function. That simply cannot be, right? So whenever somebody comes up with a social welfare function, and I of course just did that, always have this in the back of your mind, that we're doing something very peculiar here, and we're violating some fairly basic rules of reasonableness. So much about social welfare functions. I talked a lot about utilitarianism last week. We started in the seminar on the critiques of utilitarianism. Of course, there's many. One of the main that we talked about last week in the seminar is by John Rawls. And in the seminar we talked about the veil of ignorance, that if we take you away from society, we let you guys decide on what would be a just society. The best way to do that would be if you do not know what position you would hold in such a society. And Rawls called it the veil of ignorance. And he argued one thing we talked about last week, that then two things will follow. One is indeed there is very little reason to differentiate incomes. There may be good reasons to differentiate incomes. If you're a firefighter, you have to be available 24/7. If you're a professor of economics, you can just ignore emails that arrive at 3 in the morning and answer the next day, right? A firefighter cannot do that, but I can and I will, and I have. So it would stand to reason that a firefighter is compensated for, which I would consider a very strong inconvenience for having to be available 24/7, right? So that is one principle that Rawls derived from behind this veil of ignorance. The other we did not talk about is maximum liberty. That is, as long as you go about your own business and you're not hurting anybody or inconveniencing anybody else, you should just be left to your own devices, right? You should listen to the music you like, read the books you want, dress the way you like. There should be love the one you want to love. There should be absolutely no restrictions on that sort of behavior. So that is one of the main critiques of utilitarianism, and we often, as economists, and it's unclear whether Rawls would actually agree with us, and he died before he could express an opinion, is that we want to maximize the utility of the worst off, right? That is how perhaps you would construct a Rawlsian welfare function. There's other criticism of utilitarianism. Last week we talked about naturalism, we talked about libertarianism, but there's other critiques as well, mostly going back to this man here, Amartya Sen, who argued that utility is actually way too narrow a concept. Utility is not all we care about. And a strict utilitarian would say, well, as long as we're sort of doing the greatest good for the greatest number, everything is fine. But if you look at what happened in South Korea, for instance, which had a very authoritarian government that delivered great economic growth for the country, the people of South Korea would not stand for that, right? They wanted democratic rights and freedom of expression and those sort of things. Now, you may sort of be tempted to say, well, we should just stick these things into our utility function as well. But that doesn't work, because freedom is not an attribute of you as an individual, it's an attribute of society. It's not that you are free, no, you live in a free society. It's an attribute of that society, not of the individuals in that society. And that sort of, if you start valuing those things, then individual utility just doesn't cut it. Sen also argues, but those are perhaps more behavioral, more positive aspects of utility, the way we use utility to describe or predict people's behavior, rather than the normative aspect of utility, the way we evaluate things. And that has to do with responsibility and position in society. We judge people differently based on the position that they hold. If a businessman doesn't report his taxes to the revenue commissioners and gets a penalty, we think that is well deserved and we don't make much more of it. If a politician does the same thing, then the same act is evaluated differently by us, right? So depending on how you act in what capacity, or in what capacity you do these actions, determines whether we think this is bad behavior or worse, right? And similarly, and that's the agency part, we behave differently depending on the role and the responsibilities we have at that particular time. And all of us have wear different hats during the day. At the moment you're a student, right? Later in the evening you may be a friend to somebody, or you may be somebody's brother or sister, or son or daughter, right? And you behave differently in those circumstances than you do with your peers, I would think. And also we evaluate things differently depending on whether you do something to your peers or to your siblings or to your friends, right? But that is perhaps, and the fact that we behave differently is a more behavioral aspect. Altruism is another thing. In strict utilitarianism, we consider everybody to be an atom, and they only care about their own consumption. Now, that is obviously not how we behave as people. Most people care at least about some others. Many people care about many others, right? And that definitely affects our behavior. You have to wait till next year, then you can do behavioral economics, and George McCarran will show you plenty of examples of altruism, how the social context changes behavior. It's a recommended module. And altruism is definitely a good description of how people behave, but normatively it is very dangerous. Because, I mean, the one way of dealing with altruism is just to say, well, my utility depends on the utility of my wife and children, right? And hopefully vice versa. But then when you start adding up those utilities, you have a problem. Because essentially then what you say, that as a social planner, as a benevolent dictator, you should care more about people who have lots of friends and family, because their utility pops up in the utility of a great many others. Whereas loners, they just care about themselves, but nobody cares about them. So they get a lower social weight. And that is the sort of conclusion that perhaps you do not want to draw, right? So, yes, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong with utilitarianism, but 99%, maybe more, of applied economics has this, right? Social welfare is the sum of utility. And that's something to keep in mind. And I'll be doing the same throughout this module as well. So, so much for this. I was also going to talk about sustainability. So what is sustainability? I actually think that the best definition is due to the Mills. And here you see the same ugly John Stewart and a much younger Harriet Taylor Mill. And they wrote in 1857, if the earth must lose that great portion of its pleasantness which it owes to things that the unlimited increase of wealth and population would extirpate from it, for the mere purpose of enabling it to support a larger but not a happier or a better population, I sincerely hope for the sake of posterity that they will be content to be stationary long before necessity compels them to it. So there's two things going on, right? One, Mills is a classical economist, believes that there's hard resource constraints and economic growth will come to an end, right? That is the first thing, and that is long before necessity compels us to it. But actually what they argue here is that we should not go for the maximum, not the largest population, not the richest population, in strictly material terms, because there's other things out there that are valuable too, and we should restrain ourselves in order to enjoy those things, right? And this is essentially what sustainability is all about. Now, if we move forward, I think that was 130 years, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who you see here, was the chair of a committee that popularized sustainability as a concept. And they defined sustainable development or sustainability as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is the sort of modern definition of sustainability. And it is extremely popular. You will not be able to find any country on the planet or any large organization or any company on the planet that says we want to be unsustainable. Basically, every company, every organization, every country has said that sustainable development is one of our core mission. It's the thing that we want to strive for. And you can sort of see the appeal of this definition, right? Essentially what this says, yeah, we should live our lives, but not in such a way that we harm the people who come after us, right? You should leave the toilet as you would like it, at least as you found it, and preferably as you would have liked to find it, right? That is essentially what this definition says. Now, it is a short definition. I think it has intuitive appeal, but what does it actually mean, right? And people have struggled with this. What are the needs of the present? Obviously, you need to drink and to eat, right? Those are pretty obvious needs. Sometimes I must watch television because it's the only way to keep sane. Sometimes I must drink a bottle of wine, right? Because it's the only way to keep afloat. Is that really a need? Or is that something that I've convinced myself of, that it is a need, right? Now those are my needs, and I know myself pretty well. I've lived with myself for a great number of years. Do I know the needs of the future generation? Do I understand my children well enough to judge what their needs are? Do I know the needs of my grandchildren? They have not been born yet, right? That makes it difficult. And what do we mean by compromising their needs? Or rather, it's about compromising the ability to meet their needs. So if they had the ability to meet their needs but somehow choose not to, did we compromise them? Yes or no? It's actually very vague what Brundtland really meant. So, academics being academics, what they did over their years since 1987 is to try and put actually they started a little bit before that, is try and put sort of more concrete meaning to these definitions. And this is important because sustainability is at the heart of environmental policy, and it is also at the heart of some of the alternative definitions are at the heart of the controversies around environmental policy. That is why I talk about it. Now, personally, I think that was a mistake of us academics to try and come up with a better definition, a more concrete definition, because I actually think that its vagueness is its appeal. But academics being academics, they try to take it apart, and we're not sure that it fits together again. This is Billy Bragg, by the way, when he was younger. You may know him as older Billy Bragg. So, what is sustainability? There's essentially 4 schools of thought about this, and I'm going to take you through all of them. I'm going to go through fairly quickly through that. So let's start with weak sustainability. So recall that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And Jack Pazzi, who you see here, it's a very recent picture, argued that this means that utility should not fall. That as long as people at least do not grow less happy, then we're developing sustainably. Now, Hartwick argued, yeah, but utility is actually a fairly elusive concept. So perhaps we should not focus so much on utils, but we should just focus on consumption. And that led him to formulate, and this is Hartwick, John Hartwick, to formulate the Hartwick Rule, which actually, as you can see, precedes the Brundtland definition. And essentially, the Hartwick Rule says that a constant level of consumption can be maintained perpetually from an environmental endowment if all scarcity rents, net price and profit from resource extraction, are invested in other capital. That is essentially, Hartwick says, well, if we want to sort of like maintain our ability to meet the needs of the future, or we want future generations to maintain their ability to meet their needs, then we should not degrade our capital stock. That any time we cut down a forest, we're degrading part of the natural capital stock. We should not use those profits to consume, but we should use those profits to invest in other forms of capital. So that the total capital stock, natural and human-made, stays intact. Or in other words, we should live off the service flow, we should live off the interests, but we should maintain the principle, right? That is essentially the Hartwick Rule. Now, Bob Solow, who you see here, stuck this in sort of a long-term growth model and concluded, well, if we live on a finite Earth and we want to maintain the capital stock, then that can only imply that consumption is constant. Not so much as Hartwick argued that consumption should not fall, which we probably all agree on, but the fact that we live on a finite planet then means that consumption should be constant. We should not grow economically. You should be as rich or as poor as your parents. And that is, of course, something that many of us dislike, because we want to do better than our predecessors. Right? Now, doing better can be defined in many, many ways, right? You may have an agenda to become richer than your father, but you may also have on your agenda to be a better father than your father, right? And the latter is, of course, a sort of immaterial growth that is immediately reconcilable with care for the environment, whereas growing richer may not be, right? Now, these things were suggested, as I said, to sort of like make this Brundtland definition more concrete. And to an extent that has happened, but it's still not still not very concrete, right? Because if we're talking about utility or consumption, we haven't defined whose utility and whose consumption. Does this grow for everybody on the planet? Does this hold for the average or for the median? That is not defined, right? Also, when we say that things should not fall or things should be constant, then we haven't specified on what timescale that is allowed, right? So I am recovering from a pretty nasty cold. And definitely over the weekend I felt a lot worse than the week before. That's not a violation of sustainability, right? But my utility did fall over the last couple of days. So that cannot be. Does it mean that utility should be constant over, or not fall from year to year, or from decade to decade, or from century to century? Actually, they are silent on these questions, right? So even though they try to make it more concrete, they actually did not really. The key assumption of all weak definitions of utility is that substitution is allowed. It is, as long as people are roughly equally happy, things are fine. So you may enjoy a walk in the forest, but if you can replace your real walk in an actual forest by a virtual walk in a virtual forest, and your utility is just as great, and it may actually be better because we can edit out the mosquitoes and we can edit out the mud, and the virtual forest may actually be a lot more pleasant and a lot more interesting than the actual forest, and your utility has gone up and we're fine, right? So these weak definitions of sustainability allow for substitution. We can lose things as long as we replace them with something that is just as good or perhaps even better, right? And that same holds if instead of saying, well, I don't really know how to define utility, we don't really know how to measure consumption, and as soon as we start talking about consumption, we're essentially saying, well, this is the appropriate basket of consumption goods, right? You have to make judgments about that, which is of course paternalistic, right? That you would want to prescribe what your children are going to consume. That's not something you want to do. Once you have children, you quickly realize that it's a fruitless exercise anyway. So we should just focus on not so much the consumption side, but our ability to produce things. And that is what Solow again proposed. And I showed you a picture of Solow, and Talbot Page also proposed that. But that does not really answer the questions, production for whom, on what time scale, and so on and so forth. But it still says, well, if your production depends on your labor, natural capital, human-made capital, then as long as you can substitute labor for capital or human capital for natural capital, then it's all fine, right? What matters is what we get out of it. Now, those are the weak definitions of sustainability. Not surprisingly, there's also strong definitions of sustainability, and they take issue particularly with this assumption of substitution. And if we take the strongest definitions of sustainability, then natural capital should stay intact. And these were the extreme forms of naturalism that I talked about later. That if you have the right to bodily integrity, then so does an oil reserve. And it would be wrong to take away part of that oil and burn it, just as it would be wrong to take away part of your body and burn it, right? And you probably all agree that that would be the wrong thing to do if you're talking about your body. This is deep ecology is the sort of name under which this goes. One of the older proponents is Aldo Leopold. One of the contemporary proponents is Arne Næss. And if this were your position, essentially you can't do anything. You can't even die. Because if you die, there's two things we need to do. We need to bury you, and that takes up land, and that takes away land from something else. You can't do that. We can't burn you, because if we burn you, we put CO2 in the atmosphere. And that is not something we should do either. We also can't just leave you to rot, because that would put methane in the atmosphere. We can't be doing that. Right? If no substitution is allowed anywhere at any time, then essentially you can't do anything. So in practice, if you want to follow sort of this trend of thought that natural capital, the environment should stay intact, then as soon as you do something, you should do something else to compensate. So if you're building HS2 and it's going to go through a forest, and it will go through a forest, and you're cutting down those trees, then you need to compensate that by planting trees elsewhere. Right? Because the total number of forest area, according to this particular interpretation of sustainability, should stay intact. Of course, if you say, well, trees should just stay where they are, you can't build HS2, right? But then the question is, of course, where should we plant those trees? We're cutting down trees in the Midlands of England. Is it okay to plant trees in East Anglia? Is it okay to plant trees in Hungary? Is it okay to plant trees in Brazil? Does that compensate for the loss of trees in the Midlands? You need to answer that question. And of course, what you're also doing is you're cutting down old trees, but you can't create old trees. You can only plant young trees and then hope that they will grow old, right? So you need to be flexible in time as well. And the question then is, of course, also, so if we want to sort of maintain natural capital stocks, what do we actually mean by that? Do we mean by that we want to maintain habitats, that is large collection of species? Do we want to maintain individual species? Do we want just to maintain the genes, right? And those are key questions. One of the poster children of the environmental movement is the polar bear. And of course, you could say, well, they argued for protecting the polar bear because they want to maintain the habitat that is the Arctic. That's one interpretation. You can say, well, we want to actually keep the species polar bear. The ice can go, but as long as the polar bear is fine, then things are fine. Or you could say, oh, polar bears are not really a species, they're just a subspecies of the brown bear, right? Polar bear, brown bear, grizzly bear, it's all the same. So as long as one of the three survives, we're happy. Polar bears are essentially just white brown bears, right? So the answer, what do we actually want to maintain, is a fairly difficult one as well. And then, of course, we have viruses and pests, right? I, for one, am fairly happy that we eradicated smallpox in the wild. I think it survives in 4 laboratories at the moment. I will be delightful when the guinea worm goes extinct, hopefully this year, because it's an awful disease. But it is a violation of nature, right? Some people may say, well, the fact that you're calling for another species to go extinct is not necessarily a nice thing to do, right? Questions here. Other people have said, well, the whole idea of maintaining capital stocks gets us all very, very into awkward discussions. And really what we should be doing is not so much maintaining the capital stock, but going back to Hartwick's idea, we should look at the services that we derive from that natural capital. The stuff that we get out of the environment, that is what we should maintain. And if we define those services as services to humans, then of course we are back to a completely anthropocentric view of the environment, right? But of course you could take a different viewpoint there as well. In this definition, of course, we are allowing substitution back in, right? As long as services are maintained, it doesn't matter where those services come from. It doesn't matter whether you get coastal protection from a mangrove forest or from a dike, right? As long as the city is protected against floods, it's fine. Mangroves are not dikes, right? Mangroves are much prettier than dikes. And definitely much more diverse. Dikes typically have sheep on and that's it, right? If you don't like so much the anthropocentric view that we should maintain services, but really you want to maintain services, but then from an ecological point of view, then you could argue, well, we should call for the stability and resilience of the environment. Which is something that is easily defined. How would you, easy to say, but how would you actually define stable? Stability is something that in nature is something that biologists believed in the 19th century, but now we know that nature is always changing. And it's therefore very hard to say stability. What does that mean, right? Do the ice ages count as stability? Maybe, maybe not. But at least it puts some restrictions on human behavior, right? Now the third definition of, and I'll get to the fourth in a sec, the third definition of sustainability is what we think sustainability to be. Sustainability is a social construct. And it's true, right? It's not a law of nature or something. It is just something that we decide would be a good thing. Sustainability is defined as society would like to define it. Now, from this truism, some people have argued that sustainability is really about the process of defining sustainability. We're going back to a form of libertarianism, that what matters is not so much the outcome, but the process. And immediately those people who say this argue for citizens' juries, focus groups, referendums, all those sort of things. Direct democracy, that is how we should define this. And this, I believe, is a political goal jumping the environmental agenda. So what happened after 1987, Gro Harlem Brundtland came up with this definition. Everybody thought sustainability was a great idea, everybody jumped on the bandwagon, and all the other do-gooders in the world sort of said, oh my God, sustainability has run away with all the political attention. I want to be sustainable too, because then people start paying attention to my good cause again. And this is the first example that you see. So what happened was that sustainability was first redefined as the 3 pillars of sustainability, where the first pillar is environmental quality, and that's what I've been talking about so far. But then people also said, now we should also talk about distributional justice, that we don't want rich and too big a gap between rich and poor, or maybe no gap at all. But we should also not forget about economic growth. And those are the 3 pillars of sustainability. And then, of course, 10, 20 years later, the United Nations took over, and they have now defined 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And here you see the 17. They were launched by Ed Sheeran. Ed Sheeran used to be popular and cool. And here we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals as they stand now. End poverty in all its forms everywhere. End hunger. Ensure healthy life. And promote well-being for all at all ages. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality education. Achieve gender equality. Ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. And so on and so forth. So there's two peculiar things here, right? One is that sustainable development goals are sort of like tautologically defined as be sustainable. Right? Obviously, if your goal is to be sustainable, then your goal is to be sustainable, right? The fact that they stuck those words back in, only committees could do that. And the other thing is the color coding that I put in. All the sustainable development goals that are in red are social goals. I have nothing against education for all. I think it's a great thing that everybody gets a good education, obviously. Why would they otherwise work in a university, right? Has nothing to do with the environment anymore, right? So those are all the red things that you see here. The blue things have to do with economic growth, right? And you see a few blue things. The green things have to do actually with the environment. And they only come on the second list. Take urgent action to combat climate change, conserve and sustainably use the oceans, protect and restore and promote, again, sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. So of the 17 sustainable development goals, at the moment, only 3 are directly related to the environment. And 12 of the others are social goals, no longer environmental goals. And there's nothing wrong with trying to promote a good society, but it's no longer environmental care, right? Now, that leads me to my final remarks before the break. And that goes back to Jan Tinbergen, who you see there, who wrote a book in the early 50s about public policy. And one of the things that he introduced is the so-called Bergen Rule. There's actually 2 Bergen Rules, but I mean this one. And that is, if you have n problems, you need n policy interventions. Actually, this follows directly from Lagrange's work, who you also see there, on optimization. And if you forgot about your calculus, this is fairly easy to understand. If you are in a car and you're driving, it would be rather awkward if there's 2 people at a steering wheel or if you have 2 steering wheels. And it's fairly easy to go straight. You just say to the other, don't turn the wheel, right? But turning a corner with 2 people steering is actually very difficult. And what is also very difficult is if you have 2 cars but 1 steering wheel. Not 1 steering wheel each, but 1 steering wheel for both cars. Again, going straight is relatively easy, but if the cars are behind each other, the first go through the bend, then the second ends up in the ditch, right? If you want to control 2 things, 2 cars, you need 2 ways of controlling those 2 things, right? That is essentially what Tinbergen says. Now, if you want good stuff for the environment, if you want to improve environmental quality, then you need policy instruments that help you improve environmental quality. If at the same time you want to reduce the gap between rich and poor, that's a great thing too, I would think, then you need a policy instrument for that as well. And you have 2 objectives, and therefore you need 2 control knobs, not 1. And if you're saying, well, it's all the same, it's all sustainability, then you may be tempted to think, well, I can solve these 2 problems in one go. I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. But the fact that we made this a proverb is because this is actually pretty rare that you can do that. Many environmental problems originate from agriculture. Many other environmental problems originate from energy use. Now, energy is a necessary good, and food is a necessary good. And that means that the poor pay a disproportional share of their income towards food and energy. Now, if you want to make that stuff cleaner, then it also becomes more expensive. And an environmental tax, or any other way of cleaning up the environment through agriculture or energy, automatically means that you're hurting the poor more than you hurt the rich, because they spend a larger share of their income on these things, right? So these are both worthwhile goals, but you cannot solve them in the same way. And you cannot solve them with one thing. There are a very small group of very tiny exceptions to this rule, but by and large, if you have two problems or if you have n problems, you need n solutions. And the idea that you can sweep everything under one heading and call it sustainable development and then pretend we just need to do one thing just leads to a misleading understanding of the problems, hides the trade-offs, and it leads to misleading policy advice. I'm going to do a brief recap of something that you should know from your micro and your principles, but undoubtedly have forgotten. And then I'm going to talk about the core of environmental economics. That is, what do externalities and public goods do to social welfare, right? So, this is the start of lecture 2. And I'm going to start talking about efficiency and optimality. So, Aristotle argued that a trade in which both parties engage willingly and knowingly can only be mutually advantageous, otherwise you would walk away. Pareto, much later, said that a situation A is superior to situation B if no one is worse off and at least one person is better off, right? And we call that Pareto superiority. The implication of these two statements together is that voluntary trade, a voluntary barter bargain between people is Pareto improving, right? A distribution or an allocation of endowments is efficient or Pareto optimal if it is no longer possible to Pareto improve on that situation. We call it Pareto optimality, which is a nice and obscure term, although it's easily confused with optimality, right? There's nothing necessarily optimal about the Pareto optimum. And we also call it efficiency, which is fine as long as you're talking to economists, but efficiency is of course also a word that engineers and all sorts of other people attach a meaning to that is completely different from the definition that we as economists attach to the word efficiency. So neither term is entirely satisfactory. And then we have the first welfare theorem that says that a perfect market is efficient, right? Now, I'm going to start with the perfect market. Of course, environmental economics is all about imperfect markets. But we're going to start with perfect markets because you only can understand imperfection once you understand perfection. So what does efficiency mean? I'm only going to talk about static efficiency. I'm going to look at a very simple economy. We have two people, A and B. We have two goods, X and Y, and those two goods are made with two inputs, L and K. So utility of person A depends on his consumption of good X and good Y, and utility of person B depends on her consumption of goods X and Y. And both goods are made by dedicating capital and labor to this, right? So far, so definition. I'm going to use subscripts to denote first partial derivative. So the marginal utility of person A, that's a superscript of good X. So how much happier does he get if he gets a little bit more of X? Is U super A sub X, and that's the first partial derivative of his utility to his consumption of good X, right? Marginal production of good Y in labor super y sub L is the first partial derivative of the production function of good y, to the labor input into good y, right? These are just definitions. Now, efficiency comes in three parts. See, this is a reason to watch old videos, because last year I did not have a cold. Efficiency in consumption is if the marginal, the ratio of marginal utilities of the two agents in the economy, A and B, equal each other. So the first partial derivative of utility A to good X over the utility A to good Y should equal the same for person B, the marginal utility of B to good X over the marginal utility of B to good Y. And we call this the marginal rate of substitution, or rather Marshall way back when, or maybe it was Mary Paley way back when, called it this way, and therefore we still call it the marginal rate of substitution. It's easy to see that this is a prerequisite for efficiency, because if not, then you can simply barter your way to an improvement, to a situation that is better for both, right? So suppose that at the margin A values good X at 5 and good Y at 1, and B values good X at 1 and good Y at 5, then they could just swap one Y for one X, right? What happens to A is that he gives up one Y, so he loses one, but he gets one X in return, so he makes 5. So that's a net gain of 4. And what happens to person B? Well, C gives up one X, so she loses 1, but she gets one Y in return, so she gains 5. So both are better off, right? And until those marginal rates of substitution are equalized across consumers, you're not in a Pareto optimum, right? So that is efficiency in consumption in a barter economy, right? Efficiency in production means that the marginal rate of transformation should be equal. And the argument is very similar. Assume that they are not. Well, then you can shift capital from the production of one to the production of the other, shift labor the other direction, and you have more of both X and Y, right? So you're better off. So that is efficiency in production. And then we have the third component of efficiency, sometimes called X efficiency, sometimes called cross efficiency, sometimes called allocative efficiency. It's here called efficiency in the product mix. Those are all the same thing. And essentially what that says is that the ratio of marginal utilities, here of person B, but of course that's the same as the ratio for person A because of efficiency in consumption, should equal the marginal or the inverse of the marginal production. And we take the inverse of this. So on the left hand side we have X over Y. On the right hand side we have Y over X. That's because this is an opportunity cost, right? That is why you flip it. On one side we have the benefit, on the other side we have the cost. If this condition is met, then, and the other two, then we have total efficiency. Again, if this condition is not met, then you can shift labor and capital around such that each consumer, both consumers, would be better off. Not so much that you produce more as a whole, that is product efficiency, but product mix efficiency, you bring the production side together with the consumption side. And that is essentially the complete definition of efficiency in a barter economy, right? Now this is Pareto optimality, which is not the same as optimality, right? Optimality means that we're maximizing some social welfare function. And then we have the additional condition that the ratio of marginal welfare should be the same. Okay. Very brief recap of your micro, right? Now, we can do the same thing in a market economy. And then essentially what you find is that the marginal rate of substitution, right, is what I called it. Marginal rate of substitution is on the consumption side, marginal rate of transformation is on the production side. Then the marginal rate of substitution should be equal to the price ratio. And then if everybody in society faces the same prices, the same relative prices, then of course a perfect market means that we all pay the same for the same thing, is one of the characteristics of a perfect market. A market guarantees efficiency and consumption, right? Again, if this were not the case, if the utility ratio was 1 to 5 and the price ratio was 5 to 1, then what you should do is not barter with the other player, but you should sell one of your X's. And you have enough money to buy 5 Y's. So you lose one, right? Because you lost one X. But you got 5 Y's in return, and they are worth 5, so you actually gain 25. So your total gain of this transaction is 24, right? And you could do the same thing with production efficiency. The marginal productivity should equal the ratio of the input prices. And again, in a perfect market, producers face the same labor costs, face the same borrowing costs, right? So the market establishes efficiency of production. And then the market also establishes product mix efficiency. In a competitive market, producers supply at the marginal cost. So that was a very brief recap. Essentially, what we have very quickly established is that markets are efficient if and only if you meet a lazy mathematician who is too lazy to write if and only if, they write if with 2 F's. So that is what this means. Markets are efficient if and only if there's markets for everything that we care about, for all goods and services. And the property rights for these things are fully defined. There isn't an aspect of this that is undefined, right? Everything is traded. All goods and services are private. I'll come back to the definition of a private good in a second. And there's no externalities. And we further assume that all markets are perfectly competitive. And there's various ways of defining that. That means that trade is costless. That means that trade is instantaneous. That there's no transaction costs of trading, and so on and so forth. And if you further assume that all agents have perfect information and are fully rational, right? They maximize. They don't maximize with mistakes, or they don't satisfy, that at a certain point they stop maximizing when they're content with the outcome. If you make all those assumptions, then a market indeed will give you the perfect, or the Pareto optimum. Now, you can quibble or worse with all of these points. And that's not what we're going to do here, right? This is an environmental module. So we're going to talk about the environmental aspects of this. So there's many things that we care about that are not traded on markets. We care about clean air, we care about wilderness, we care about the fact that there's whales swimming in the ocean. You cannot buy that. You cannot go on Amazon and order clean air, right? But it's obviously important to us because it keeps our lungs healthy, and hopefully your lungs are healthier than mine. Many things out there in the environment are public goods. Well, exactly define that later. Or open access, which is an impure public good. Climate is a public good, right? We all enjoy it together or not. Ocean fisheries is another. There's no ownership of the fish stocks in the ocean. There's ownership of fish in the exclusive economic zone, but everything that is more than 200 nautical miles out of the coast essentially belongs to nobody and therefore to everybody. Many of the things that are important for environmental problems, energy, agriculture, and so on and so forth, the markets for those things are far from perfect, right? The oil market is a clear example where you see this awesome market power by OPEC, but the same is true for agricultural markets where we have a lot of distortions through subsidies and trade barriers and so on and so forth. These are not perfect markets, right? And then of course we have externalities. I caught a few of you guys vaping outside and producing, presumably you guys enjoy that, but you also put some of this stuff in the environment and perhaps bother other people with that, right? So that is an externality. So if something goes wrong in these markets, right, and with the environment many things goes wrong, then you cannot assume, or actually you can know for certain, that your market, unregulated, will not deliver the Pareto optimum, right? That is something you can be sure of. So, let's start with the first one. What is an externality? There are a number of words for this, and there's actually confusion in the literature about what is an externality. But this is my definition. An externality or an external effect is said to occur if the production or the consumption of one agent affects the utility of another agent in an unintended way and when no compensation is made. So an externality is three aspects, right? One, it is unintended. Two, it is uncompensated. And three, it affects a third party. So what do we mean by unintentional? It's not that we don't foresee the consequences, but it's just not the main purpose of why we do things. So if you burn coal to make electricity, your intention is to make electricity and sell it at a profit. If you do so, you also make acidifying substances. You emit them into the atmosphere, sulfur and nitrous oxides and those sort of things. And you emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That is not why you burn the coal. You burn the coal to make electricity. So the intention is making electricity, and the CO2 emission is an unintended consequence of this, right? Now, you make the electricity, you sell it to your clients, right? That is a transfer. So your client is not a third party. Your client is engaged in the transaction. But the CO2, but the sulfur you put into the atmosphere causes acid rain, and does damage to buildings and to human health and to forests. Now let's focus on the asthma that it causes. The people who your coal burning caused asthma for, I'm losing my English, are not engaged in any transaction with you, right? They don't have a contract with you, they didn't buy a product of you. They are a third party to your coal burning. And then if this is not compensated, if you're not paying for the damage that you have done to them, then it is an externality, right? And it has to meet those three things. When that compensation is made in one way or another, we talk about the internalization of the externality. Now that is an older term. If you're going to do if you're going to do behavioral next term, or the term after, then George is also going to talk about internalities. Internalized externalities are not internalities. Internalities are essentially externalities you do to yourself. That is, if you're addicted to some sort of substance, that is an internality because it's not good for you and you know better, but somehow you can't control yourself. That is an internality. There's nothing to do with externality or internalized externalities. Now, I tend to call these things externalities. In the literature, you also find external effects, external costs, external economies, right? Those are all the same thing. We're here in an environmental course, so I'm going to talk about negative externalities. Emissions that do harm to the environment, emissions that do harm to human health. But actually, if you go back into your old economics textbooks, externalities used to be positive. And the sort of the old textbook example is the honeybee, right? So if you're a beekeeper, you keep bees to make honey. That is your intention. And then the unintended consequence of your beekeeping is that they go out and pollinate the orchard next door. That is not your intention, right? And no transaction between you, these are old textbooks, no transaction between you and the fruit grower next door, and therefore it's not compensated either, right? But that's a positive thing, right? Now, as I said, this used to be in old textbooks. Externalities used to be positive. Actually, if you go back in the history, then the first externalities identified by Marshall were all positive. That's one thing. Second, bees by now are marketized, right? If you have an orchard, you're going to hire those bees to come work for you. And that's actually a very intriguing market about beehives and everything. But it used to be, externalities used to be positive, and they used to be about bees. No longer. So, what does this do to our markets, right? And I'm going to give you two examples. First on what this actually does to efficiency, and then on how to restore efficiency. So production efficiency says that the marginal production of good X in labor, so how much X you get if you put in a little bit more labor over how much X you get if you put in a little bit more capital, right? And that's the ratio on the left-hand side, should equal the relative price ratio. And I changed the P into S's because now I'm talking about social prices rather than market prices. So the SL over SK is essentially not the market price of labor, but it's the social worth of labor. And the same is true for the SK, it's the social worth of capital. Now, if that social worth consists of two components, a market component plus something that is not on the market, then SL equals PL plus EL, right? And same SK equals PK over plus EK, sorry. So that is what we would like to do. But if the producer only sees the market but does not see the social consequences of their labor, of their use of labor and the use of capital, then the unregulated market would do this. Not the top one, but this. And if PL over PK is not the same as SL over SK, the market would misallocate labor and capital, right? So let's look at that again. And this is a silly example, but it's the simplest way to do it. Let's assume that there's two producers, Y and X, and the profit of making Y is what you see there. So that's the price of selling it, PY, times how much you make, Y. And for simplicity, I'm going to assume that you only need labor to make Y. So the cost is the cost of labor, that's PL, times the amount of labor that you need, right? So that is the profit of making Y. Now there's another company that uses X, or that makes X, and has a very similar product structure. So you have your sale price, PX, and then X is the amount of X that you make, and then your cost is the amount of capital that you use and the price of capital. So that is the profit function of the producer of X. And as an input into the production of X, there's actually two factors of production. One is capital, and the other is some function of the amount of labor that the other company uses. Now, this is a very stylized example. Essentially, what is sort of the way to think about this is that the workers of factory Y, that is the L, all go to work at the same time, cause congestion, and that hinders the transport through driverless cars, because there's no workers in company X, right? Of company X, right? That is the way to think about this. Now, it's a silly example. Any more realistic example would make the math much more difficult, right? So let's stick with a simple example. We have a company Y, and the workers of company Y are a nuisance to company X. That's essentially how to read this. Now, what does company Y do? It has a profit function. It wants to maximize that, so it takes the pi, the L. That's the only decision it makes, right? So P Y L, that's the first partial derivative, minus PL equals 0. Company X does the same thing. Px x sub k minus pk must be 0. And you can reorganize this such that Py is PL over YL, so that's the price you get, no, the price you pay, this is the price of labor over your marginal productivity, must equal how much you get out of it, right, per unit of production. And the same is true for Px. So this is what the market would do. Individual optimization, price takers. If we look at this from a social perspective, we want to maximize the joint profit of the two companies. That is pi x plus y, and that's just the sum of the two things. And then the following happens. If we look at the first company, the company that makes X, so we want to consider how much capital to use, right? So d pi x plus y over dk is px xk minus pk. That's the same thing, right? There's no k in this term here. There's no k in this term here. So essentially we added something, but there was no dependence on k, so the first order condition is the same as we had before, right? We had px xk minus pk is 0 before, we have it again. However, if we take the joint profits and its first partial derivative to the amount of labor that we use, and recall that it's labor that is causing the problem in this case, we still have this thing here, right, just as we had before. We still have this thing here, just as we had before, px yl minus pl. That was there before. It's still there. But now we also need to include what does my use of labor do to the production of good X. And that goes through that transformation function L. That's why I use the chain rule. And I need to multiply that with the price of px because I'm not interested in the physical production. I'm interested in the value added, right? Or in the revenue. And what we have is that the price of X, the price at which we sell X, should still be the price of the input over the relative productivity, or the marginal productivity, sorry. But the price at which we sell good Y is no longer the price of labor over the marginal production of labor, but it's the price of labor minus the external effect over the marginal productivity of labor. Right? This is the social optimum, and this is now different from the private optimum, right? Or the private equilibrium, I should say, not an optimum. Now, how do we establish this? What you could do, suggestion, is because the workers that make Y are a nuisance, I'm going to put a tax on labor. That's, of course, in retrospect, you guys know that that's it, what come out. When this was first suggested, people did sit up. So we're going to change the profit function of making Y. It's Py times Y, that's your revenue, right? PL times L, that is your labor cost. But we're going to apply a tax on the amount of labor that you use, and we're going to call that tax tau. And we're going to do nothing with the production of X. So the private optimization, individual optimization is still px xk minus pk must equal 0. The pi y dl has changed. It's still py yl minus pl, but now we also have the first partial derivative of tau l there, right? So we have to subtract a tau from that. Rework that. The price at which we sell X hasn't changed. The price at which we sell Y has changed. We have to add a tau there, right? Now, in the joint optimization, we wanted this. Now we find this. So if we set the tax on labor equal to minus px xm ml, then we're back in the social optimum, right? The minus sign here is because this effect is negative. No, sorry, this effect is negative. If there's more congestion, if there's more workers, then production goes down. So this term is negative, so the tau becomes positive, right? Don't get confused there with my signs. Now, this particular tax is called the Pigou tax. After Alfred Pigou. It's Vilfredo Pareto and Alfred Pigou, right? So that tax that exactly restores the social optimum, the Pareto optimum, in case of externalities is known as the Pigou tax. Now Pigou wrote about this, and this is what he wrote. If the amount of investment in any industry was carried exactly to the point at which the value of the marginal net and social net product there is equal to the central value of the marginal social net products, the national dividend, so far as that industry is concerned, would be maximized. Disregarding the possibility of multiple maximum positions, I propose for convenience to call the investment that would then be made in the industry the ideal investment, and the output that would be obtained the ideal output. Under conditions of simple competition, if any industry, the value of the marginal net, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. This is the original definition of the Pigou tax. Now read it and see whether you understand it. It is actually exactly the same as the one that I just showed. Students sometimes complain that we use mathematics, right? What is easier to understand? This thing or this thing, right? This is what you need to know. The tax should be equal to the marginal damage done. And then you restore efficiency. I can do it in 3 sentences after I've shown you the math, right? Pigou needed 4 paragraphs. It actually says exactly the same. And it's a very precise definition. Now this is known as the Pigou tax. And the Pigou tax is applied to externalities. And this is a bit unfortunate. Not because Pigou did not write this. He did, and he was the first to write this. And he was the first to suggest what we now call a Pigou tax. But Pigou did not know what externalities were. He had a very warped idea of externalities. And really the example that I showed you is due to Francis Bator, not to Alfred Pigou. So Pigou proposed a tax on externalities, but did not know what externalities were, right? Doesn't matter. Now, some people refer to the Pigou tax, or the imposition of a Pigou tax, as the polluter pays principle. That is not the same thing. The polluter pays principle simply says the polluter should pay, whereas the Pigou tax also specifies how much the polluter should pay. And the polluter pays principle is often interpreted as a legal liability, where the polluter pays all the damage done. But the Pigou tax, you pay the damage at the margin, not the total, at the margin, right? And only if your damages are linear, the two are the same. So the Pigou tax is not the same as the polluter pays principle. Now, Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize for other work, had a misconception that is actually common about the taxation of externalities. And that is that the tax revenue should be used to compensate the victims. That the Pigou tax is not paid to the government, but it's paid to those who suffer the consequences of the pollution. Or maybe the Pigou tax is paid directly to those who suffer the consequences from pollution. This is not true. What matters is that compensation is paid, that you pay the damage that your pollution does at the margin. It doesn't matter who you pay to. And it was Beaumont, who you see here, who showed that Buchanan was wrong. Buchanan won the Nobel Prize, and Baumol did not, to a lot of people's, including his, chagrin. Because compensation is a lump sum transfer. So the PGU tax, the tax on your pollution, changes your behavior and therefore restores your restores efficiency. Essentially, essentially what happens there is that wages go up, right? From the perspective of the producer, instead of paying somebody's wage, you now pay their wage plus a tax. So your costs have gone up, so you're going to make less of the stuff, right? And therefore cause less congestion in this particular example. So the PGU tax corrects behavior. Now, if we take that tax revenue, tau L, and give it to somebody, say company X, that is an income transfer. That does not affect behavior, right? Because they choose how much X to make and how much capital to employ, and they just get tau L, right? It does not affect their behavior. Tau L, d tau L, dk is 0. So by the second welfare theorem, this compensation, which you may argue is the right thing to do, does not affect behavior. This is second welfare territory. This is a redistribution of income. It gets you to a different Pareto optimum. It does not necessarily get you to a higher or a lower Pareto optimum, right? And that insight is due to this gentleman here.